Over the last 30 years, the forces of autocracy have revived all across the globe. Its hallmarks are familiar ones: contempt for the rule of law, contempt for democratic freedom, contempt for the truth itself. Today, Russia has strangled democracy. Putin has the gall to say he's denazifying Ukraine. It's a lie. It's just cynical. He knows that. And it's also obscene. Don't even think about moving on one single inch of NATO territory. We have sacred obligation. We have a sacred obligation under Article 5 to defend each and every inch of NATO territory with the full force of our collective power.
I love that line, Mika. Don't even think about moving on a single solitary inch of NATO soil. We have, the President of the United States says to all of his NATO partners, all of his NATO allies, we have a sacred obligation.
President Biden capping his trip to Europe with a forceful speech in Poland, denouncing Putin's invasion of Ukraine, casting it as a critical moment in the fight to protect democracy and to defeat autocracy. Welcome back to Morning Joe. It's the top of the hour, 1 minute past, Monday, March 28th. Let's bring in U.S. Special Correspondent for BBC News, Katty Kay, President of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, MSNBC contributor Mike Barnicle, and Professor of History at Tulane University, Walter Isaacson. It's great to have you all on board this hour.
Walter, you're a history professor. Talk about, at the top of the show, we talked about JFK. Saying that all free men were citizens of Berlin, all free people. Ronald Reagan at the Brandenburg Gate saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. This was historic in the 21st century, and it wasn't in Berlin. No, it's moved east. Now it's in Warsaw. What great news for the people of Warsaw, who were first absolutely destroyed by Hitler and then abused by Stalin for so many years.
Well, yeah, you are getting the world divided, as Biden said, into two parts, and those who are freedom-loving. And unlike the tear down this wall, or for that matter, an Iron Curtain is descending, I read Roma Shratnazar's wonderful book about the tear down this wall line, and Richard Haass was there. It was very much discussed before it was put into the speech and debated. Of course, Joe Biden does what Joe Biden sometimes does, is just blurt out what he really believes and is the truth. But I think it was a good moral statement. I think that we don't do regime change. It's up to the Russians to do it. But he's right. He's right to express a moral sentiment that given this world we're living in today and given what Russia did, good Lord, this guy cannot stay in power. So everybody's calling it a gaffe, but typical of a Michael Kinsley definition of a gaffe is when a politician blurts out the truth. And I think for Joe Biden, that was a moment of moral clarity, even if it confused, some of the message he was trying to send.
Well, I have said it very clearly, said to Richard Haass this weekend. I think creative ambiguity is a good thing, especially when you have Vladimir Putin keeping the United States of America guessing over the past 3-4 weeks. I think it's time to change those dynamics. Richard, I know you disagree with that, but let me just say, in defense of those in the State Department who have been going behind clarifying, again, that creates a creative ambiguity like we've had in Taiwan for some time. I think that's a very good thing. You don't. Explain why.
Joe, I think everything we say, everything we do at this point ought to be measured against two yardsticks. One, does it end this war as soon as possible on terms the Ukrainian government can accept? And two, does it discourage Russia? Does it make it less likely that Russia escalates, be it by spreading the war to NATO, by using cyber attacks, by using chemical or, God forbid, nuclear weapons? And my concern with the speech, my concern with the line at the end, is that I think it works against that. What it's done is in some ways taken what has been up to now a disciplined, limited war, and in some ways made it existential for Putin. I don't want him to think that he has nothing to lose by escalating against NATO or by using chemical or nuclear weapons. I want him to feel that he does have a lot to lose. I want us still to be able to negotiate with him to bring this war to an end, again, on terms President Zelensky can accept. So I think the president went too far. And let me just say why the Reagan parallel doesn't work here. Tear down this wall. That was a policy push. This is something much more fundamental and existential against Putin and against the nature of a totalitarian system. Second of all, this statement was made by President Biden in the middle of a hot war in a country bordering on 4 NATO countries. Most important, Mikhail Gorbachev is not the head of Russia now. What we have instead is someone much darker, much more evil, who is essentially unconstrained. This is a far, far, far more dangerous situation. I simply don't understand why we would want to escalate it, particularly at a point where, as you discussed earlier, we're beginning to see some signals that the Russians know they overreached. They may be trying to redefine success, not in ways that would be acceptable to us or Ukraine, but at least in a more limited way. The goal of U.S. policy at this point ought to be, again, to end this war, prevent escalation. Down the road, yes, then we can work to see that Russia changes its either politics or its leadership. This man is destroying his own country as well as Ukraine.
Well, you know, Richard, you and I usually agree on most everything. I couldn't disagree with you more on every point. We'll get back to that. But it's almost as much of a divide as when we talk Red Sox and Yankees. But we'll get back to you on that as well. But Mike Barnacle, I have found my biggest criticism of Joe Biden over the past 3 weeks is it's almost like international relations are imitating domestic relations. Republicans play for the kill. I say that as a former Republican, and when I campaigned, I didn't play by Marcus of Queensberry rules. I played to win. That's all that mattered. You got to win. Win cleanly, but you got to win. And I've been criticizing Democrats for playing by Marcus of Queensberry rules over in the age of Trump. They act so shocked. Oh, wait, there are these rules you have to play within the boundaries, and if you don't, why, when we go low, blah, blah, blah. No, you got to win. And you've got to let the other side know that you're not scared of them. The fact that Joe Biden didn't play by Marcus of Queensberry rules, the fact that he gave a scripted State of the Union speech, and then as he turned to give the speech to Nancy Pelosi and others, he said, let's go get him. He did that on purpose. People who are saying that this was some mistake are fools. And then after this speech, near the end of the speech, he says this as well. Joe Biden's been doing this longer than most people criticizing him have been alive. It's psyops. He's letting Vladimir Putin know we're not playing in between the lines. And I think most Americans agree with him. Putin is a butcher, and Putin shouldn't stay in power later on. State Department did their job cleaning it up. We understand. But we got to be grown up enough to have a little bit of creative ambiguity. And that's exactly where Biden has Putin right now. Guessing, finally.
Well, you know, Joe, and Richard is right here, and I respectfully disagree with Richard on this as well. But Joe Biden has been at this for a long time, and he's been thinking about Vladimir Putin for a long time. And I'm told by a couple of different people who are very reliable and quite close to the West Wing and to the President of the United States that was not an ad lib. It was not, those 9 words were not just dropped in off the top of his head. He's been thinking about this for some time. He's been thinking about it all through 2013. When Vladimir Putin helped Syria drop chemical weapons on its own people, 2014, when the Russians invaded Chechnya. And what happened to Vladimir Putin during that time? Nothing. He skated. And I think it is always stuck in Joe Biden's craw that Vladimir Putin seems to think he can get away with anything that he wants to, whenever he wants to. And I think this was not only a message to Vladimir Putin, I think it was a message to the people around Vladimir Putin, who might be getting kind of shaky, given the offensive production of the Russian army right now. So there was a lot going on here in that speech, but it was a speech given by a strong president of the United States with a very strong message that Western Europe, NATO, and the United States is determined to win this war on behalf of Ukraine and on behalf of liberty and freedom throughout the world.
So let's circle back to Richard Haass. I want you to defend yourself, but I want to question you as well, though, because in your comments you said, you know, we want to still be able to negotiate with him. I'm not sure there's very healthy negotiating with a butcher, with someone who's doing what he's doing in Ukraine at this moment. If you take a look at Mariupol, how are you negotiating with this person? Aren't we sort of past that? And in terms of the threat of nukes, that's mutually assured destruction. That's a choice. That's a choice that we can't control. Isn't it true, as Joe Biden said, that Vladimir Putin is no longer feasible anymore as a leader on the world stage?
Yeah, Don Rumsfeld once said, you go to war with the army you've got, not with the army you want. You've got to negotiate with the adversaries you have, not the adversaries you want. Or to quote somebody else, Yitzhak Rabin talked about you make peace with your enemies, not with your friends. We want this war to stay limited, Mika. You and I both want that. We want Ukraine to stop getting pummeled by these Russian missiles that are being shot off with great frequency. The only guy who can stop this war is the guy who started it, Vladimir Putin. So whether there's a formal negotiation or an informal negotiation, we have got to assume that this war only terminates or winds down if he says so. Down the road, again, I would love to see an alternative leadership there, but at the moment, we have to assume that we can only end this war on his watch.
Caddy, jump in.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of debate about 9 words, and I agree largely this is a storm in a teacup. We know where the U.S. position is. It wasn't helpful to the extent that we want to keep the focus on getting Russian troops out of Ukraine. More broadly, it perhaps wasn't helpful because there are potential splits, as Volodymyr Zelensky himself recognized over the course of the weekend in an interview with The Economist, in the NATO members. And you want to do everything you can to make it possible for NATO to stay together and not allow splits in aims to emerge within the group. Obviously, what Zelensky needs now, though, Walter, is more troops. He needs action now. He's not engaged and focused on the esoterics of words and what they might mean in a historical context, because he's fighting a real hot war with an enormous amount of urgency. If he doesn't get these weapons from the West in the next week or two, he may not have a war to fight anymore.
Yeah, well, that may be true, but let me say, too, that I think he's shown good willingness to try to keep negotiations alive, and that interview he gave to the 4 Russian journalists, you know, laid a bit of a groundwork, which is the fact that, of course, in the end, Ukraine could stay a neutral nation, which was one of Russia's goals. The second part is you're going to have realities on the ground, which is Crimea and parts of the Donbass are going to be Russian occupied. You don't have to settle everything. You can get a ceasefire and say, we're just going to recognize the realities on the ground. What I think Zelensky is doing brilliantly is rallying his people, rallying his troops, helping fight the Russians, but also showing that he can be realistic and looking for a settlement to this. Because if, Caddy, you keep giving weapons, I agree we should. If this war goes on 2, 3, 4 more years, it destroys Ukraine, it destroys the world economy, it destroys Russia, but it's also really bad here. So it wouldn't be I would really back Zelensky, not just militarily, but in his diplomatic offensives.
So Ukrainian President Zelensky is ramping up his criticism of the West. He's calling out countries that support Ukraine in speeches but are slow or unwilling to provide military aid. In a video address yesterday, Zelensky compared Western leaders with fighters in the besieged city of Mariupol. Their determination, heroism, and firmness are astonishing, he said. If only those who have been thinking for 31 days on how to hand over dozens of jets and tanks had 1% of their courage. As we mentioned in a separate interview with The Economist, Zelensky asserted that some countries had drawn a red line at sending more offensive weapons to Ukraine because they're afraid of Russia, and that's it. And those who say it first are the first to be afraid. He called for a full embargo on Russian oil and gas exports rather than what he called incomplete sanctions, saying we are not guinea pigs to be experimented on. Western officials contend that they have already provided an extraordinary amount of financial and military support to Ukraine and have promised to continue. Mike Barnacle, Zelensky begging for everything. There are reports that they need, arms along the coast, arms that can attack ships, that can travel on the back of Humvees. They need like athletic military equipment that can get to them fast, and there's no word on whether it's happening, but it might be.
Yeah, Mika, they need us. They need the world. I mean, we can sit here in this set this morning. We can sit anywhere in the United States. We can sit anywhere in most large parts of Western Europe and talk about, well, it's a limited war. It's not a limited war if you live in Ukraine. It's not a limited war when you see your country being destroyed around you, literally destroyed around you. It's not a limited war when perhaps as much as a third of the population of Ukraine has had to leave, been forced to leave. So, yeah, he does need all of that. And thankfully, through some miracle, we are still maintaining to get equipment and weaponry into Ukraine on a ground route, which is incredibly difficult at this stage. So the biggest story of this war might be, in the end, the president of Ukraine and what he has become. He's become a global figure, a symbol of courage, leadership, unity, preservation, survival, you name it. And he's a role model for everything that seems to be being fought for in Ukraine. Liberty, freedom, equality, the right to be able to live the way you want to live without an oppressor taking your land and your country away from you. So, yeah, he needs us.
Yeah, and Richard Haas, obviously, though, he has been critical for quite some time about the West not doing enough. We have obviously, in the United States at least, we have authorized an extraordinary amount of weaponry and over $13 billion worth of support, humanitarian and military support. David Ignatius, who's been to the border, says that our weaponry is just streaming in at an astonishing rate, and it has. But now he's saying he needs planes. He needs tanks. He needs anti-missile weapons. He needs anti-ship weapons. Are we getting them to him? How do we get them to him? And how do we break the logjam right now between the U.S. and our allies and some of those who want to be more aggressive and some of those who want to hold back?
One of the lessons militarily of this war, Joe, is that these large platforms, be they tanks or planes or what have you, are vulnerable to these systems, anti-missile systems, anti-ship systems, and so forth. So all of those, from drones to anti-ship systems to get at those Russian vessels in the Black Sea, anti-tank munitions, surface-to-air missiles, we ought to be flooding Ukraine. That we need to flood the zone with that. The other great weakness in our policy is the European and particularly German dependence on Russian gas. And that continues. That's what's essentially floating the Russian economy here. So the more that can be done to turn down that spigot, because that's what Putin's getting, what, $750 million a day? That's what's floating his economy. So what we've got to do is, again, give Ukraine the weapon systems it needs, and secondly, begin to reduce Russian gas exports. If those two things happen, then I think there's a decent chance this will wind down.
Well, 23 past the hour. Here's a look at some of the other stories making headlines this morning. Democratic lawmakers are calling for Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas to recuse himself from future cases related to the 2020 election. This comes after it was revealed that his wife, Ginny Thomas, texted former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, urging him to challenge Donald Trump's election loss. The text messages were part of a trove of documents and messages that Meadows turned over to the House committee investigating the deadly Capitol riots before he stopped cooperating with the investigation.
You have the wife of a sitting Supreme Court justice advocating for an insurrection, advocating for overturning a legal election to the sitting president's chief of staff. And she also knows this election, these cases are going to come before her husband. This is a textbook case for removing him, recusing him from these decisions. And I don't think, all I hear is silence from the Supreme Court right now, and that better change in the coming week.
Clearly, Justice Thomas should have recused himself. That's not even at question here. And I think that we also have a thorough investigation to better understand exactly what has happened with the judge's wife.
Question is, why didn't he recuse himself from decisions pertaining to the 2020 election before this? It's crazy. And there are a lot of questions about him. White House Deputy Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre has tested positive for COVID-19. The announcement comes just 5 days after Press Secretary Jen Psaki said she tested positive for the virus. Jean-Pierre filled in for Psaki during President Biden's trip overseas to Europe last week. In a statement yesterday, Jean-Pierre said she has not been in close proximity to the president in recent days and is only experiencing mild symptoms. Taylor Hawkins, drummer of the Foo Fighters, died suddenly on Friday. The band was in Colombia to play at a festival in Bogota on Friday night. Few immediate details were available after the news of his death, though the band said in a statement that his passing was, quote, a tragic and untimely loss. Colombia's prosecutor's office released a statement Saturday saying a preliminary toxicology report found 10 psychoactive substances in his system. Authorities have not yet ruled on a cause of death or have completed their investigation. In a statement, the band wrote, quote, his musical spirit and infectious laughter will live on with us, all of us, forever. Our hearts go out to his wife, children, and family, for sure. And the White House could be days away from allowing Americans over the age of 50 to get a second COVID vaccine booster shot. NBC News correspondent Katie Beck has the latest on that.
Older Americans could have the chance to get a second booster shot to protect against COVID-19. The FDA is not expected to recommend the shot, but will likely authorize it for those over 50 years old, according to the New York Times. The White House acting with hopes of keeping hospitalizations and death rates low.
Does it confuse people when it's not specific, if it's sort of left up to you?
It does confuse people. We often like to have things pretty clear. It is safer to think about having this fourth shot sooner rather than later.
Data from a recent Israeli study supports that idea and shows second boosters can be effective at lowering the risk of death. The study, done among older adults, found mortality due to COVID-19 during the Omicron surge was significantly lower among those who'd received an additional booster dose. In the majority of states across the country, encouraging signs on the COVID front. Numbers going down, but a new and contagious variant has arrived. CDC data shows 1/3 of COVID cases in the U.S. are now the Omicron subvariant BA.2, with Nevada, Colorado, D.C., and New York all seeing cases rise.
Is the term booster kind of getting outdated?
So the fourth shot is basically like a seasonal recommendation. And in fact, I do think all Americans will need to get used to the idea.
Medical experts say those eligible for a fourth shot should consider their personal risk factors. For many Americans, a new and important choice. Coming soon. Katie Beck, NBC News.